Hey everyone, welcome to the meeting. My name's Todd Casey. Thanks for coming today. The reason for having this meeting with you all, or everyone who's attending, is that health and safety comes up all the time in our discussions in my classes and my workshops, and also on Patreon through Q&As or questions that are asked. So I figured, why not go to the pros? I've answered it extensively, but I believe that the pros could add a little bit more to it. So today we have Mary Weisenberger, I hope I said that correctly, from Gamblin Paints. I've been working with Gamblin since the first book because they have excellent customer service. And I think—
Thank you.
I think at the time I just had some questions, and then I ended up on a phone call with, I think it was Dave at the time. And then I think he talked to me for like 2 hours, and I was like, these are people that really care about their products and really educating people. So I reached out to Mary, and we talked about maybe doing one on health and safety, GAMSOL, mineral spirits, things like that, studio practices that we can really be mindful of to get us in a good place. So without further ado, Mary, you want to take it from here?
Yeah, thanks, Todd. And excited to be here. Really appreciate you inviting me on this. And hi, everyone. My name is Mary Weisenberger. I am a product specialist for Gamblin. One of the things Gamblin's always done since Robert Gamblin started our company in 1980. Back then, there was no internet. There was no hotline. There really wasn't very much in terms of information available on these really important topics like health, safety. And from the very get-go, when Robert started our company, his main mission was to first find safer alternatives for oil painters, to lead oil painting into the future, but with contemporary materials that were safer for both artists and the environment. The other part of that was he really wanted to promote education, providing a resource, somewhere for people to go when they have questions, when they need to troubleshoot something. So since over 42 years ago, that has been the real heart of Gamblin's approach. And it's something we really try to uphold as much as possible in the present day through phone consultations, emails, and then things like this with Todd, where we're meeting with people over video. So I just want to throw this out to anybody in the audience that later on, if there is a question that you can't have answered during this session, you're always welcome to contact us directly on your own, gamblincolors.com. We offer a lot of resources there, and you can also set up your own individual phone call or Zoom call as well if you have like a specific topic, project, or idea that you really want to troubleshoot and make informed decisions about. I always want to mention that to folks, that once this Zoom meeting with Todd ends, I'm not going away. Everybody is always welcome to get in contact with Gamblin again. And yeah, today we're going to be mostly focusing on GAMSOL, mineral spirits, best practices. And then at the end of this talk, I'm also going to be outlining a lot of ways that you can really safely work without GAMSOL in an oil painting studio as well, since there are great solvent-free alternatives too. With that, I'm actually going to be flipping the orientation of my camera here. You can see we got some bright sunshine here today, but I'm going to move our view this way so that all of you have a tabletop view of some of the materials I'm going to be demonstrating during the talk.
So just so you all know, we are putting some links in the chat. They will be downloadable at the end. We're going to take this and put it in the post, but there's a link right now for gamblincolors.com. So as Mary mentions a few things, we're going to pop them over in the chat, so you'll have the links to all this information.
And forgive me, the sunlight will probably be moving during this demonstration, so you can probably expect the shadow to slowly recede, but it seems like we got a nice little little opportunity right here for some light.
Amazing. So Mary, should we start? Do you want me to ask the questions?
Yeah, let's start.
So why should we be mindful of materials, the health and the safety?
The why aspect. This is really important. You got to think, one, about your own personal safety as a painter. And this is something that is really important because over a lifetime of painting, you may be painting for several decades or even longer. And during that time period as well, it's important to remember how you have other visitors in your studio. You might have visiting artists, you might have friends and family, you might have pets in your studio, and making sure that it's set up accordingly so that you can enjoy the process, but also not compromise your health is really important. Something that has been real stigmatized with oil painting is over the years, the many years, is that it had a relative toxicity to it. And much of that had nothing to do with the oil paint itself. The oil colors themselves are non-toxic. They're simple mixtures of linseed oil and pigment with little much else. All of the toxicity concerns related to oil painting have often boiled down to the use of solvent that you have for thinning colors, making washes, and also for cleanup at the end of a painting session. Gamsol, Gamblin's odorless mineral spirit, this is the standard on the market for studio safety. Gamsol, technically though, even though it is odorless, you cannot smell it. This does not mean that it's something that you want to be breathing in for an extended period of time, especially in a small enclosed space. That's because Gamsol is a petroleum product. It's derived from petroleum distillates. It has almost all of the harmful aromatics removed, but we try not to kid around about how when you are painting with Gamsol, you need to be mindful about how it is evaporating into your immediate breathing space. Now, something we often get asked at Gamblin is what is the difference between something like Gamsol versus other solvents that you may be familiar with? Very, very commonly used several decades ago, and even further back, centuries, the most commonly used solvent oil painters had was turpentine. And turpentine kind of is responsible for giving oil painting somewhat of a bad reputation, since turpentine is a rather harsh solvent with a lot of harmful aromatic components to it. There are other various grades of mineral spirits as well. Someone might wonder, hey, why can't I just get mineral spirits from my hardware store that are a lot less expensive and say the same thing, mineral spirits on them? Why should I get the Gamsol when I can get something for a lot less money at Home Depot or Lowe's? But there is a very clear distinction that sets Gamsol apart from other solvents available to painters. I'd say one of the biggest one is actually skin contact. Gamsol does not absorb into skin. We don't recommend washing up with Gamsol, like washing your hands with it. But if you do accidentally get some Gamsol on your hands, it does not absorb or otherwise, leach into your body. That is something that other solvents have the ability to do. That is certainly the case for turpentine. It can absorb into bloodstreams. Gamsol does not do that. Two other big safety components with Gamsol that set it apart from other solvents are flash point and evaporation rate. I'll cover flash point first because it's the scarier aspect. Something like turpentine has a flash point of around 90 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Yikes. That means it takes a pretty low temperature, around 90 to 95, for something like turpentine to be able to ignite and cause a flame or have a spark ignite it. Gamsol, on the other hand, has an incredibly high flash point. Gamsol's flash point is above 144 degrees Fahrenheit. That means that this is technically not a flammable material. In fact, a really fun fact that a lot of folks don't know is that Gamsol's flash point is at such a high level, it's permissible on airplanes in checked luggage. That's right, this stuff, you can fly with Gamsol. It's actually not categorized as a harmful, flammable material by TSA if you provide the appropriate safety data sheets in your luggage and highlight the flash point. That's how stable this is in terms of relative flammability, combustibility. Gamsol is very fire safe. It does not need to be stored in a fire safe cabinet for that reason. The other big thing, and we'll get more into this later, is evaporation of Gamsol. We'll talk later about how important it is to be mindful of evaporation when it comes to odorless mineral spirits, but something that sets Gamsol apart from other solvents available to painters is that it has the slowest evaporation rate of solvents. This means much less of it is evaporating over an extended period of time while you're painting, whereas other solvents, such as hardware store variety mineral spirits or turpentine, certainly, those have a much faster evaporation rate. And that means you're breathing in a lot more of it during your painting, your painting studio session. Those are the three things that really comprise why Gamsol has been adopted as one of the safest solvents available for oil painters, is it has a majority of the harmful aromatics removed. It has a very high flash point, and it has a very slow evaporation rate comparatively to other colors. Yeah. All right, Todd, I think that answered that pretty well, right? What sets Gamsol apart?
Yeah, that's totally
awesome.
amazing. And you actually answer some questions that we've brought up. I know the TSA thing recently came through and asked me, and I said I wouldn't take it on a plane. So that's pretty awesome.
Yeah, just don't take it in your carry-on luggage is what I often tell people. At Gamblin, we've clocked thousands of airtime miles with all of our materials. Everything in our material line is actually approved for TSA transport and checked luggage. My best piece of advice for folks, especially since this has been coming up a lot more frequently this summer, people are finally traveling again after a 2-year hiatus. And we've been getting a lot of questions on our tech line about what you can and cannot bring. And as long as you thoughtfully pack your supplies, I recommend plastic baggies, Ziploc baggies, and having those safety data sheets from the manufacturer thoughtfully packed in your luggage. If you have all of that, TSA actually, they won't see any problem with our materials flying. That was a little off topic from what we were originally going to talk about, but it's definitely a fun one to mention since so many people are actually going on fun destination trips with the painting adventures again.
Yeah, so let me just mention that on your website, Gamblin has the SDS sheets, their safety data sheets. We've also put them in the chat over here. So if you ever need those and you need to download them, that's one of the reasons why I love you guys is that it's all right there on your website. when I usually fly, I print out a new one, I pack my bag, and I throw. I was throwing them with my oil paints. I'll now travel with Gamsol, which I didn't know in the past.
Yeah. Yeah, it saves you from having to go to the art supply store when you get there, and that's real helpful too if you're going international, because not all international art supply stores carry Gamblin. A lot of them do, but there's lots of them out there that might not for, import fees. So it's really nice. I would recommend if you do fly with Gamsol. I've once gotten away with taking a 33.8 fluid ounce, but to play it on the safe side, I would maybe pack the smaller bottles and maybe just bring a couple, like 2 or 3 small bottles. That sometimes really helps. And my only other advice too is if it's a new bottle, that that is useful. The only time I've heard of a gal who had her Gamsol confiscated was because her label was really dirty, like it was covered everywhere in like paint smears, and you could barely, it was like halfway used. That's the only instance I've heard of someone getting their Gamsol nicked, and I think it was purely they just looked at the dirty bottle and said,
Didn't know what it was. Yeah.
they said nope. So if you have a clean newly opened or unopened bottle of Gamsol, that actually is got such a high flash point to it, it can fly with you and all your other art supply materials.
Fantastic. There was actually one of our students is an airline pilot, and last time I flew, he actually talked to the head of TSA, and
Nice.
yeah, and he was basically just saying that there is a certain amount of paint size I think they'll allow. So I think it would be wise to get a smaller bottle.
Yeah, get your small tubes, bring your small tubes, bring a little bottle. Yeah. And don't ever bring anything on the plane that is unlabeled. We'll get into that in a little bit, the importance of labeling all of your solvents.
Yeah, so let's get back to that maybe on the Q&A. So back to the evaporation part of it. What are some ways, if it is evaporating into the air, that we should be mindful in our studio, or ways to kind of get it? What should we be doing? What do you recommend Gamsol users to do?
That's one of something we get all the time. People looking to reduce and really manage the evaporation of solvent in their studios. So one really good rule of thumb is to always have the lids open, have the lids shut as much as possible. Leave them open for ideally the shortest amount of time. As soon as you open your brush cleaning jar or anything that has solvent in it, which could also apply to your oil painting mediums, such as something like Galkid Light, Liquin by Winsor and Newton. That's another good example of those faster drying mediums that have solvent in them. Anytime your solvent jar is opening, or you have some medium with solvent out in a little cup or a dish, be very mindful about how this means petroleum distillates are now evaporating into your painting area. And even if it's odorless, you can't forget this. I make sure that is a stress point, is even though it's odorless, that doesn't mean you're not still breathing it. The nice thing about Gamsol, however, is that it's had so much of the harmful aromatics removed. You only require a pretty minimal amount of ventilation. You don't need to be getting a really fancy exhaust fan necessarily. Oftentimes, just cracking a window, having a window open is more than enough to get some fresh air in your studio and safely work with Gamsol. What I always try to stress to painters is how you want to think about where the most amount of solvent is evaporating in your space. Now, for most painters, if you're using a little bit of Gamsol to say thin your color out, give it a little bit more flow, this means where the Gamsol is evaporating is physically on your palette and on your painting itself, that you are literally hovering over assuming most of you aren't, using giant long paintbrushes and standing 3 to 4 feet away from your paintings. Most of us are hovering directly above our paintings and directly above your palette while you're painting. And you may have an open jar of Gamsol or an open container of medium close by as well. That is where the solvent is immediately evaporating into your physical breathing space. And one thing I really stress to folks when you're setting up the ventilation in your studio, what you want to do, in addition to having some type of window open to provide fresh air, it's really smart to have some type of fan very close to your immediate painting area. What I have, and I'd have to move the camera awkwardly to show you this, but I actually have a box fan, and it's not a fancy fan by any means. It's your ordinary box fan, and it's positioned right down by my feet, and it's positioned so it's blowing air away from me. It's not blowing air at me, it's blowing away from me, and it's actually pointed towards where an open window is. Now that is what you want to try to create in your painting studio. Instead of having this Gamsol evaporate directly off your palette and directly off of your painting into the air you're breathing, you want to have a fan situated to help create a cross current. A cross current of ventilation is really helpful in order to move the air and to get an exchange of air in your immediate breathing space. And if you set that up, having some type of open window and then a supplementary fan or multiple fans even to help move the solvent away, that is just the smallest, easiest steps you can take to pretty safely work with Gamsol, even for a 7 to 8 hour painting session. And then I'll stress this again, is that whenever you're not using your solvents, you want to make sure you get the lid on every single time. That's really important. And I know I'm a painter myself. I know how easy it is to forget. You'll have your Gamsol out, you'll get the child safety cap off, and it'll just be kind of hanging out there with its lid open. You gotta really be on top of that stuff. It's very important, especially when you think in the long term, several years of painting, your health and safety over an extended period of time. These small little simple steps actually make a big difference. And airflow, air exchange, getting fresh air and a cross current of air, those are really easy things you can set up even in a small studio like your living room, a spare bedroom or office. Later on, we'll talk about solvent-free methods, because there are some folks out there that have limited space. Maybe they don't have a window. Maybe it's a situation where they can't open windows. So later on, towards the end of our talk, we'll cover some solvent-free methods too, for those situations.
So Mary, you'd say also like, I've seen people in studios where they open their, turp jar and then it's right under their face. So the solvent's evaporating up into their direct, their face, their nose. You'd say at least like a foot away, right? So you reach for it.
Yeah, ideally. I always mention this. I'm sure everyone here is familiar with the late and great Bob Ross. There's always those shots of him in his show where it's exactly what you just described, Todd. He had a big old bucket of turpentine right there at the bottom of the easel, and that was kind of one of his gimmicky things during the Joy of Painting broadcast, is the beat the devil out of it thing, where
Off the brush.
He takes the brush, gets it real wet, and then just goes really crazy. Well, there's been a lot of speculation. Nobody knows exactly how Bob Ross developed cancer, which eventually did kill him, you know, at a rather early age. He could have been painting probably to this day, maybe, because what was happening in that specific situation was, not only was he very, very close to the open solvent jar, that motion of really rigorously beating the brush was probably atomizing solvent. So it wasn't just slowly evaporating, he was physically agitating it so that it was atomizing almost like an aerosol.
Wow.
And what I would also speculate is, I really doubt the small studio he worked at PBS had a lot of ventilation. That's just my speculation. I don't know if that is or is not true, but I always mention that as a really great example of maybe a situation you might not want to use for your solvent setup.
Yeah.
As much of a huge fan I am of Bob Ross, that always makes me wince a little bit whenever I see an episode and he does that kind of brush cleaning method.
Yeah. Let me also add one little tip. Don't put a glass of water or anything that's clear next to your Gamsol. Yeah. And no, that's not good.
Yeah, definitely. Something too, I always that actually brings up a great point I wanted to really stress for folks here, is that properly labeling everything is very important. And Gamsol itself comes in a plastic bottle. You can put Gamsol into anything you want. You can put it into a glass jar like I have here. This was a peanut butter jar. You can put Gamsol into any ordinary plastic. I like having this as an example. This is like a plastic spray thing, and I have a little cap up here for it. And when I want to clean my palette, it's really easy to just dispense out and just spray it out. But what's really important is that, one, it has a cap for when I'm done with it, and two, I've labeled it for what it is. We would really discourage anybody from putting their Gamsol in any type of beverage container, coffee cups, solo cups, those types of things that could be confused as a beverage container. Do not put your Gamsol in. It should always have a good lid, and it should be properly labeled. You can, and we'll link to this as well in the chat. At the Gamblin website, we actually have downloadable templates for you to print off the label for Gamsol. And this is Avery 5163 labels. Really, really easy. And then you can just take this off and slap it on any old jar. What I really like about these peanut butter jars is they have a good airtight lid. In fact, sometimes I get these jar lids on there so tight, I have some relative difficulty opening them later on. Have to get my husband to help open it for me. And it's really important, though, that it has a good lid. And even if you don't want to download the Gamsol label itself, just having something like masking tape that is clearly labeled Gamsol, it's very important, because this is a clear, odorless material. You don't know who might be in your studio at some point. You want to make sure things are properly labeled, and that Gamsol could never be confused with water or another type of clear, odorless type of liquid.
Yeah. So while we're here, let me just mention also, I'm not sure if everyone knows this, Gamblin Varnish Gamvar also has Gamsol in it. So
yes,
in the same sense, keep that a distance from you as you pour it into a cup. I think eventually we're going to get into a varnish webinar like this too, so we can talk about the proper way to do it. But again, the same thing, it's evaporating up into the air. You want to make sure that that's at least a good foot from you. I actually love your cold wax. That also has Gamvar in it as well. So just take a look at the label. You guys do an awesome job of labeling everything that's in it. And Gamsol is in a bunch of your products. So keep on.
Yeah, like for example, I mentioned this earlier, one of our most popular painting mediums is Galkid Light. It's a very, very thin fluid alkyd plus Gamsol combination. What's super popular about it is that it can thin your color for nice washes, underpaintings, or glazes, and it dries in a very timely manner compared to linseed oil, which can take weeks. Alkyd mediums often take maybe a day or two by comparison. But much of that is because there is a solvent component to mediums like Galkyd Light. Evaporation is a faster process than oxidation. So on average, most painting mediums that contain a solvent are going to dry faster than something that is solvent free, like our solvent free gel, as an example. I'll get more into solvent free gel when we get to the solvent free topics at the end of the talk. But that is a clear distinction when it comes to mediums too. Mediums that have Gamsol in them often dry much faster than mediums that are just oil and only oxidize. And, you know, there's pros and cons, I think, always to consider if you want to paint with solvents or if you don't want to paint with solvents. There are lots of avenues you can explore and different things, pros and cons to think about when you're making those choices.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a good it's funny because we talk about paints and we always say dry, right? Where they're really oxidizing. You know,
yes.
Right. So what is it that Gamsol is doing to the oxidation process of oil paint?
Yeah, this is a great, really fun tip. And I'm just going to get this paint here in this last little sliver of light I have in my studio so y'all can see it. Gamsol, a lot of people think of Gamsol as a medium on its own, but we kind of try to discourage that use in a couple aspects. If you're using just a little bit of Gamsol to thin out your oil color, that's fine. A little bit of Gamsol really does a nice job of relaxing the paint and making it easier to manipulate, because sometimes you'll find an oil color that is really stiff, dry, maybe difficult to spread out thinly. And for an underpainting where you want a thin wash and maybe a little bit of transparency to see the canvas or panel primer below, you might want to thin out your paint a little bit. However, when you're just using something like Gamsol on its own to thin your paint, what this is doing is it is dissolving, like physically dissolving the linseed oil binder that's used to make your oil color. And Gamsol as a material, as it's evaporating out of your paint film, it's completely dissipating 100%. Gamsol evaporates away without leaving any residue or any trace material. It just completely vanishes. It's gone. Once all that Gamsol has evaporated out of your paint, it has not left any type of additional oil binder in the color. So for this reason, we really caution artists against going too crazy with Gamsol washes in the initial painting phase. If you need a lot of a fluid medium to thin out your oil color, you're much better off utilizing an alkyd medium. Galkyd Light can also be thinned with additional Gamsol. You can add more Gamsol to the Galkyd or Galkyd Light if you feel that you want to get it just a little bit thinner and more washy. What sets this apart is that Galkyd Light has a little bit of alkyd oil in it. That amount of oil is what does help keep a little stability for your initial painting layers, because that oxidizes and remains in the paint film rather than evaporating out. So Todd brings up a really great point. When we're thinking about how an oil painting dries, there's two methods in which an oil painting can dry. The first is evaporation of solvent evaporating out of the paint film. And this occurs first. That is a faster process. They can't happen at the same time. Evaporation and oxidation can't occur within the same moment. So what happens first is all of the solvent evaporates out of the paint film, and then the oil begins to oxidize. And that is a completely different process than evaporation. When oxidation is occurring, nothing is off-gassing out of the paint. Instead, oxygen is being pulled into the paint. And that's how the individual molecular chains of oil link together and form a dry paint film. And I think that's really important when, if you're new to oil painting, you're new to solvents, you're new to mediums and all the various ones, it's important to understand that oil paintings don't off-gas necessarily. The paint itself is not off-gassing. It's the solvent, like Gamsol, that you use to thin your color is the material that is evaporating out of your oil painting. The oil itself is not producing any fumes or requiring any ventilation.
Wow, that's awesome. So
yeah, it's fun stuff.
So some of the things obviously that happen as you start to work with Gamsol, I work with it all the time. I try to keep my covers on the tops of, I have like a tin that I carry around everywhere. In my workshops, I'm always telling students on breaks, please cover your Gamsol, any of your solvents. What happens with any kind of jar is that the sediment is going right, the Gamsol goes to the top, the sediment falls to the bottom. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Oh yeah, because something else that is really fun about Gamsol, and I'm just moving my little setup here so we get more sunlight. Soon we're going to be against the wall over there. But something that is interesting about Gamsol is how it's reusable. Now, when you get yourself Gamsol, I know it can have a big price point to it compared, especially when you look at those other types of solvents out there. But the thing about even a liter of Gamsol like this can last you upwards of a year if you recycle it continuously, which is something folks don't always realize. I personally usually take about 2 to 3 years to go through a gallon of Gamsol. Takes me about 2 to 3 years to need to pick up a new one. And I paint on a weekly basis. Someone who paints every day may go through their Gamsol a lot faster than I do, but I like to mention that just as a comparison, if you're painting on a somewhat regular weekly to semi-weekly basis, a large jug of Gamsol can actually last you quite a while. I'm gonna open this up now, my Gamsol jar. And I was painting last night, so this is a pretty fresh jar that I have on my hands here. And as you can see, it's dirty. It's got a bunch of green in it, a bunch of cadmium, some phthalo, I think a little bit of white in there. So right now, this Gamsol that I used yesterday evening, it's not going to be as helpful for cleaning my brush out at this point because it's gotten really dirty. And as you can see, when I do that and I'm wiping it on the rim here to remove pigment from the brush, it's just getting dirtier, which that can be really frustrating, especially if you have a lot of nice brushes you want to take care of. Trekell makes really nice brushes, and they have some great stuff. I don't know if y'all probably talk about Trekell. They have great tips on brush care. But really, if you want to cut all the oil and medium out of your brushes quickly, Gamsol is your best friend. So this jar with my green in it, that's a good example of a dirty jar that's going to need to sit for a few days. So I'm going to put the lid back on that securely. And I'll show you another jar that has been sitting for just about 3 to 4 days. And look at that, it's clear. And I'll open this back up too, just so you can see the relative comparison of these two solvent jars.
Wow.
So all of that is a lot of pigment. Everything is still in suspension with the Gamsol. But over the next 3 to 4 days, what's going to happen is all of the pigment is going to settle to the bottom of the jar. And what's happened in this jar that's a couple days unused is all of my pigment settled down. And what I have on the top here is perfectly usable Gamsol that can still really effectively clean out my brushes. And you can skim this off the top. You can deposit it into another type of vessel or brush cleaning jar. What I often do is I have about 3 or 4 of these in various levels of settling rotation. So they kind of rotate in and out. And for this example, you know, my one jar from yesterday evening is too dirty now, but the nice thing is I have this jar that was waiting. And look, if I just go in there and start to, you know, wet my brush, maybe remove some of the excess paint that was on there on a rag or paper towel, and then just start, you know, working there, wiping it on the rim. If you can see, I'm already pretty much got most of the paint out of that brush already pretty quickly. And you can see that Gamsol water is not water, that Gamsol solvent is starting to get a little bit dirty as I clean that brush. But over time, same with this jar here, everything is going to settle down to the bottom. And I call that stuff, that sweet stuff, that's your pigment sludge right there at the bottom of the jar. And you'll find some pigments take longer to settle. Whites, opaque colors, earth tones, heavier, denser pigments like umbers, siennas, titanium white is a big one too. Those heavier pigments, they settle much faster than more transparent pigments do. So this is something I like to mention to folks. If you paint with a lot of really transparent pigments like phthalos, phthalo green, phthalo blue, quinacridone red is a big one. Those types of pigments that are very transparent, they actually are lighter in terms of their molecular structure. They're lighter weight, and they sometimes hover in your Gamsol jar for a little bit longer than your denser pigments do. So I'd say it's a 2 to 3 day average for most of your pigments to settle down to the bottom and kind of collect as the sludge in the bottom of your brush cleaning jar. But don't be surprised if you were doing a painting with, say, like a lot of quinacridone red as an example. It'd be totally normal for most of your pigments to have settled, but maybe you have like a little bit of a pink tinge, little bit of a stain of that quinacridone pigment. That might stick around a few days longer. Or like a really transparent blue, phthalo blue is definitely another one of those pigments that might take a few more days longer to settle. But a question we often get from folks is, well, what do I do with that pigment that's settled at the bottom of my jar? What do I do with that eventually? You have a couple of different options. If you want to be thrifty, if you want to get the most out of your oil colors, you can actually pour out all that Gamsol into a new vessel, a new brush cleaning jar, or maybe consolidate the Gamsol into a bigger jar with some more solvent. And you can scoop out the sludge from the bottom of your jar. I'm not going to demonstrate this for you guys right now on camera because it's a very messy procedure, full disclosure. But what's really nice about all that sludge that's collected at the bottom of your jar is it often makes a very nice monochromatic gray mixture that can be pretty successfully used for toning paintings with a nice gray background. If you do that and you get all of the sludge and pigment reclaimed out of your jar, I might recommend putting in a little bit of medium, just a little bit of like Galkid Light, linseed, safflower oil, and mix it up really well. That usually keeps pretty well in a small jar, or you could tube it into an empty aluminum tube. But lots of people actually take the sludge and their recycled pigment from the bottom of their jars and they remake it into paint, which is super cool if you want to get the most out of your oil colors. Now, that process I just described is not for everybody. And I'm going to be good. I'm going to put the lids on my Gamsol now that we're done demonstrating that, but not everybody wants to do that recycling process I just mentioned with the pigment sludge. If you just want to get rid of that stuff, there's a couple of options. One thing I've found works just fine is if you get all of that sludge out of your Gamsol jar, you can actually slather it out onto some absorbent rags, cardboard, paper towels, as an example, and just put it outside to dry. And what's going to happen is all of the Gamsol that might be in the sludge is going to evaporate away completely. And at that point, you can just safely dispose of the dry pigment sludge in your household or studio garbage pretty safely. This kind of leads us into the next topic that Todd and I wanted to talk about, is actually, what do you do with your Gamsol when it's done? When it does get to a point where you do got to eventually get rid of it. And this can depend a lot on how often you paint, how much paint you use, the period of time, that you spend painting. But eventually your Gamsol does get used up, and it can take a couple years on average, or shorter if you're someone who paints with a lot of frequency. Todd and I have talked about how one thing you can do is, if you go to like your local automotive store, like a Jiffy Lube or somewhere like that, a lot of the time they will take solvents for you. They often have a service that'll pick them up. They have a big barrel where they can put all the solvents together and have it properly taken away to a recycling plant. Because that is kind of the key thing to remember about Gamsol, is this: when it's done, you do not want to pour it down the drain. You do not want to dump it in your bushes. Those are examples of how you should not dispose of your Gamsol. And I'd say you can usually start to tell when the Gamsol is starting to go bad. It'll begin to take on a more rancid smell. And what that is it's the oil that was in your brushes in concentration. And it's essentially your Gamsol is going bad due to the linseed oil, and it will become somewhat smelly, have a lot more of a harsh odor to it from the linseed oil going rancid. And then it'll stop being very effective at all of your brush cleaning. The pigments will start to slow in their settling process, or they may just not settle at all. Those are some telltale signs that you need to replace your Gamsol with fresh solvent. Now, you can drop it off at like a local automotive shop. Usually they take that, especially if you're a customer of theirs, not just some random Joe, but maybe someone who goes there. Your other option that you have is to actually just look into your local hazmat and recycling waste center in your city or county. There are usually drop-off locations that you can take solvents to. And when you arrive at that facility, if you simply tell them what you have, they'll make sure it goes to the right location. And what you want to tell them is that it's a petroleum based mineral spirit, and then they'll be able to properly dispose of and likely actually recycle the Gamsol. But it's really important that you don't just dump it somewhere. You got to responsibly dispose of your Gamsol when you decide it's time to move on, and that happens for all sorts of reasons. Maybe you do a big move, like you move out of state, you move a long way, and you don't want to be schlucking some dirty Gamsol jars in your moving van. That's just one example that comes to mind. It's really important to be mindful about the way you store your Gamsol with a good lid, but it will last you a while, and eventually you'll need to dispose of it properly.
Wow, that's awesome. So when I can see that you're basically taking your brush and putting it onto your paper towel there. So the paper towel has some kind of mineral spirits OMS into it, right? Gamsol. What do you do with that? How do you dispose of that? And what do you recommend people to do? Like once I know you and I have talked about this, but I know a lot of people kind of scrunch them up and put them into a ball and then throw them into a garbage. Do you want to talk about what you'd recommend for stuff like that?
Yeah, so what you just described, Todd, scrunching something like this is dry, but for demonstration purposes, imagine that this rag here was still wet, still had oil color on it coming off on your finger, had a lot of Gamsol on it. This type of dirty rag, and this type here, be it a paper towel, a shop rag, an old t-shirt, there's all sorts of things you can use for brush cleaning rags, but you need to remember about how this is a possible fire hazard, actually. So when you have a dirty used rag, you do not want to crumple it up and throw it in the trash with a bunch of other rags. That's probably the worst way to deal with these types of dirty rags at the end of your painting session, is to just throw them all out. The reason is due to heat, actually, not so much Gamsol, but the actual linseed oil, alkyd oil, or safflower oil that you were using in mixture and in the paint. Similar to a compost pile, if you get a really big compost pile in your yard and it gets really hot out, the center of a compost pile can get so warm and gets hot to such a high degree that it has the ability to smolder, combust, and start a fire. Linseed oil and dirty oil painting rags are actually a very similar example, very, very similar, because if you have a bunch of these rags, like here's one, here's another one, and they're all soaked in oil, and you throw them like in a corner of your studio, or you throw them in the trash, or you're just very not very conscious about the way you're storing and disposing of these rags, they do pose a fire risk, because a large pile of oil-soaked flammable materials like paper towels, t-shirts, etc. It's the same situation where a large pile of rags, and this is, you would need maybe a dozen more rags or somewhere thereabout, and pretty soaked in oil, but the center of the rag pile can start to get so hot because oil paints oxidize. They pull oxygen into themselves, and while oxidation is occurring, a very small amount of exothermic heat and energy is being produced. Oxidation creates a very, very small amount of heat. This is not a problem if the rag is laying flat to dry, either on your tabletop or maybe on your studio floor. It is a hazard though if you have a big pile of rags collected in excess and they're all balled up together. It can be a real fire hazard, and it's something that we kind of stress to folks. And you got a couple of options to consider when you're setting up your oil painting studio or when you are disposing of these rags. Now, someone like me, I paint really small. I don't use big brushes. I'm not generating a lot of rags. Like a fresh rag like this one, a fresh paper towel, that'll last me a couple painting sessions before it gets really, really dirty. Something you can do if you're in a smaller setup, you're normally not creating that many dirty rags. So something that's real easy is just laying them flat to dry, laying them out individually on the floor, on your tabletop, maybe next to your studio area. That's one way you can do it. What I've also found too is if you have ceilings, like high ceilings, you could pin a clothing line up from one end to the other. And with like safety pins, as an example, you could lay them flat to dry in the air and just air dry in your studio. Once you have a rag like this one, for an example, where all the colors coming off, like when I touch this rag, I don't have any paint coming off on my hand. It's dry. All the Gamsol has evaporated away completely. And what I have here is just dry oil. When your rag goes from being wet and dirty to being dry and dirty, this means all the oxidation has occurred. When the paint is dry, nothing is oxidizing anymore. That means at this point, your rag is safe to dispose of in your household or studio garbage at that point, and it's not going to be a fire risk. If you're in a situation though where, like, say you have a rag that's got a lot of paint on it, this isn't a very much paint, but just for demonstration purposes, something that is soaked and covered in oil, and maybe for whatever reason you're in a situation where you can't let it lay flat or hang out to dry, you got to get rid of it like right then and there. Maybe workshop situations, plein air painting, those are all kind of examples of like, what do I do with this wet rag? I need to get rid of it right now, not in a couple days when the rag dries. Something you could do in that situation is get a Ziploc bag, something that's got a good tight seal on it. Take the rags, put them in the Ziploc baggie, and then fill that up as much as you can with water, and then seal it off so there's not any air in the bag. So what you have there is basically a bag with some water and some dirty paint rags in it. And when you're in a pinch, that is one way that you can dispose of dirty used rags and get them into a garbage bin or into the trash without the fear of possible spontaneous combustion if the rags get too hot. That's something, you know, I often talk with folks a lot about Gamsol, a lot about safety, and the danger of oily rags is often overlooked, or not even, people are not even aware of the fire hazard that dirty oil stained rags can pose to a painter, which is why I always make a point to actually emphasize it, that it could be more of a physical safety hazard than your Gamsol will ever be, is properly disposing of your used rags. What some people do too, in larger studios, like if you have a shared studio with a lot of painters, maybe it's a workshop setting, you may have seen what's called the oily rag bins. And you can get those, you can get them from Uline for, what is it, Todd, like 70 bucks,
Yeah.
70 bucks. Don't, you got one of those in your studio? Yeah.
Yeah. Especially because when I have anyone come in and paint together, you know, it's hard for them to take anything with them. So we have to kind of figure out a way to dispose of them. But all the workshops that I teach at, I always give, don't throw it in the garbage because you're making a large heap. Look for a red bin. It's that's what's highly recommended for anyone to throw their rags in.
Yep. Yeah, and an individual painter who mostly paints solo a majority of the time, the red oily can bin isn't crucial, but I always mention it for people in shared studios or like Todd's example, workshops and stuff, because those red bins are designed to trap oxygen so that in the presence of a fire, it is smothered. In the event that a fire does happen, it won't escape the bin. At the Gamblin factory, we go through hundreds of dirty rags on a monthly basis because we use Gamsol to clean all of our equipment, all of the mixing room buckets, the rolls on our industrial 3-roll mill, tools, the tubing equipment to get the paint into the Gamblin tubes. Everything gets thoroughly cleaned in between colors with Gamsol, and that's really crucial because it prevents cross contamination. It's what prevents getting pigment into your nice white paint. Which is also why we dedicate our Tuesdays to just making white oil color as just a fun fact for any of you out there. And like if we're making green on a particular day, it'll just be green paint all day long. But we try to keep all of the equipment really clean in between colors. And Gamsol is literally what we use day in, day out. At the Gamblin factory, we have large cleaning stations, very similar to what I showed here with a brush cleaning jar, just on a massive scale. And something else at our factory that we have is we have about a dozen or so of those red oily rag bins scattered throughout every crevice of the factory, so that if anyone has a spill, anybody makes a mess, there's always a bin close by where the rag can be disposed of, and then those eventually do dry in the bin itself too. It takes longer than if you lay it out flat to dry, but eventually those do dry out in the bin and can be safely disposed of. The main purpose of the bin, though, is that it has a really airtight seal, kind of similar to these peanut butter jars. It really traps anything from coming in or out of the jar. And if you want to be really fancy and have something that'll just be a safe place for you to put the rags and then not worry about them at all, the oily rag bin is another great option. And for anyone out there that doesn't want to splurge on the $70 Uline one, if you get a galvanized steel garbage can, that's pretty close to, in terms of something that's really airtight. A galvanized steel garbage with a good lid on it, those function pretty well for oily rag receptacles. What I really like about the red oily rag bins from Uline is they have a foot pedal on them, so you can just use your foot, it pops open the lid, and then you throw your dirty used rags in there. That's what I like about those oily rag red bins. But I have worked in studios where a galvanized steel garbage can would also function as a good fireproof location to put your used rags and paper towels.
Yeah, it's the same material. We put a link or Kalina put a link in the chat for the Just Right one off of Amazon for $75.44, and it's galvanized steel. So it sounds like it's the same material. There's a couple options she's put in there. There's one at Lowe's. I got mine at Uline, but there's plenty of places, I'm sure, locally or online, you could check to find out a galvanized steel barrel.
The Lowe's one is just a regular trash can.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and that would work just as good too if you don't want to have the fanciest setup. But like I said earlier, the ones that have the foot pedal, there's something kind of satisfying about the foot pedal,
Yeah,
in my opinion.
I agree. That's what I have.
I guess before we move on, I think the next area we're going to move into is just the solvent-free aspects. If
Yeah.
you just want to completely eliminate, but I just want to make sure I didn't miss anything on Gamsol and solvents before we move on.
I think you got it all. I mean, the only other thing, like I said, that I highly recommend, and I say this because I've done it, is don't put a glass of water next to your Gamsol. You'll probably dip in the wrong thing. Even coffee I've done, and I've dipped in my coffee. Try to not be drinking around your Gamsol or put your cup near it.
Wise words, very wise words. Or I have a water bottle too, where you gotta like physically open the lid to get to drink water. I think that's another good one too. Like you have a water bottle that's got a good lid on it too, so you're not just absentmindedly reaching for things and sipping them.
Yeah.
Yes.
The
Very
other thing
important.
I'd say is take breaks a lot. I say it in my teaching all the time. Get out of the studio, let that air flow, get it, as Mary said, get the fan on and open
Fresh
a
air.
window or
Get
two.
some,
Yeah. And
yeah,
then
maybe
let it blow out.
go for a little 5-10 minute walk around the block. That can make a huge difference. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, so let's go into the solvent free. So, one of the reasons why I got into it is that I have a 3.5-year-old, and when my wife got pregnant, she said, what about some of the stuff that you're doing? She's an artist too, so she kind of knew about it. And I said, yeah. And that's, I think, when I was writing the Art Still Life, I talked to Dave at that time about solvent free methods, and he sent me a bottle of the safflower oil to try. So why don't we talk about that in terms of pregnant women, kids, pets, just of course, health for anybody.
Everything, all the things. Yeah. So that's another thing that we get really often, and with some increasing frequency in the last few years, actually, is the desire to eliminate the use of solvent, either heavily reduce or completely eliminate the use of solvent in your oil painting studio. And I always stress about how it's very easy to accomplish. You can actually set up a whole oil painting studio that doesn't require any solvent, no evaporation. And in those situations, ventilation is technically not required. Since I covered at the beginning of the talk how your oil colors themselves are just oil, like linseed or safflower, and pigment. This here isn't producing any type of fume or off-gassing or evaporating anything into your space. And the same is true for mediums and materials like just safflower oil or a solvent-free medium. They are not off-gassing, and they don't produce fumes in a studio. There's lots of reasons why one might eliminate the use of solvent. Todd touched on a really good one. We talked to a lot of folks who might be expecting. They're having a kid. Maybe it's their first, their second, their third, but general consensus we've received from OBGYN doctors is how during pregnancy, solvent exposure should just be avoided in general, along with a lot of other things. I'm not a doctor, but I know that how when you're in that medical condition, there's a lot of stuff actually that you don't want to do for the health of you and a baby. Other examples though, you might have young children in your studio. You might have people who visit your studio that have sensitivity to chemicals. That's a growing occurrence too, is we speak with people who are actually pretty sensitive to mild odorless mineral spirits like Gamsol. A majority of people, Gamsol does not bother them, but there are folks out there who can't be around it. It bothers them. So the last situation I always mention for why one should go solvent free is when you're unable to get proper ventilation in your space. Maybe the space is too small. Maybe there's no windows. Maybe there's no way to get fans going. Maybe this is a good example for over here on the West Coast. I don't know if any of y'all live on the West Side, but we now have a 5th season during the year called wildfire season, where the air quality outside becomes so hazardous that it's not safe to open windows. It's not safe to breathe the air that's outside. I've had this happen with a lot of frequency in the last few years, where there might be several days in those really hot periods with wildfire smoke where you can't open your window and you can't get fresh air. And a lot of the time I've been increasingly painting solvent free during those times. When you're painting solvent free, you have a couple of great options. Actually, a lot of people just work with oil colors straight from the tube without any additional added solvent or medium. At Gamblin, we've tried to make it so that our colors aren't too stiff, so you can still manipulate them under a brush or knife, that you don't need to add medium to them. But in the instance where you do maybe want something to extend the paint out, what I'd recommend you try is our solvent-free mediums. Here I'm showing off the solvent-free gel, but we also have a fluid version of this too. It's easier to see the gel on camera too. You can see it's got a nice gel structure. And I'm gonna mix it in with this warm white oil color. And what it mainly would do is give the paint a little bit more flow, little bit more manipulative, make it more manipulative off the brush. I might even add a little bit of green, make a nice bright green there. It also adds some more gloss, a little bit of transparency. Something like the solvent-free gel or solvent-free fluid would dry more quickly than if you were just using linseed oil, like pure linseed oil, which is also solvent-free, like just linseed, just safflower oil. Those are also solvent-free, but they can be really slow drying. What I like about the solvent-free gel is that it will speed up the dry time a little bit compared to if you were using a pure oil like linseed oil does. It won't dry as quickly as your Galkid Light, which has solvent in it, but it will help speed things up a little bit at least, which is nice. And then solvent-free gel just does, you still maintain brush marks, and I'll move this so you can kind of see the way the paint handles on the palette here. You can still get nice marks, nice juicy brush strokes. And if you wanted something with a little bit more flow to it, I'd recommend the solvent-free fluid as that alternative. What's great about these is if you're just painting with your oil paint straight from the tube, maybe a little bit of some solvent-free medium, nothing is evaporating in that situation. Nothing is off-gassing out of your paint, and you can really safely paint without any need for ventilation that way. What then becomes tricky is your cleanup, however, because, you know, Gamsol works so well for cleaning up oils, but there are solvent-free alternatives even when it comes to your brush cleaning methods. My main thing I always stress to people when they're transferring their studio from using Gamsol to using something like safflower oil for brush cleaning, it takes a little bit of a learning curve because things don't go as quick as they normally do. When you're using Gamsol and you got a dirty brush and you swish it in there, all of that oil, all of the color comes out pretty quickly. Safflower oil isn't going to do that as quick, but it will get the job done for you. What I'd recommend you do instead of putting your safflower oil in a big jar or a big tub like Gamsol, don't do that, because safflower oil doesn't have that fun ability where the pigment will settle over time. It won't recycle in the same way that I demonstrated earlier. So this is the top of I think it was like a sauce can or something, it's just a shallow little dish. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pour not a crazy amount of safflower oil in there, just a good amount, enough to cover the bottom. And notice how when I'm working with safflower oil, I don't have to worry about getting that lid on there. It can just hang out with the lid open because it's not evaporating. The first thing you're going to really want to do is get as much of the color off on your rag. That's kind of the thing about the solvent-free method, is you do generate more dirty rags. That's because instead of the pigment going to the bottom of your Gamsol jar, it's going onto your rag. So that's the one thing I've found, is that this process takes a little bit longer, and it does generate more dirty rags and more dirty towels is the thing. So to start, I've done a pretty thorough job of trying to get as much of that color and as much of that gel medium off of my brush. And I've gotten a good amount of it out of there, but as you can see, there's still a little bit in there. This is where your safflower oil is going to come in, and you don't need a whole lot in there. In place of swishing this around, what I'm going to be doing is very gently kneading the brush into the oil like that, just pressing it down and having it kind of gently press against the bottom of my lid there. And then back to the rag, and you wipe really good. And I'll bring this back up to the camera so you can see a lot of that color, a lot of that medium, that solvent-free gel is now transferring into there. So I'm going to wipe really well again on my rag, get that nice and then just repeat the process. So instead of swishing like you would in a solvent jar, you're just really gently kind of pressing it into the oil. You can watch as more color seeps into the safflower oil. And then I'm going to go back to my wipe. Now at this point, look at that. We actually have most of the color is coming out, as you can see. Like you can see there, here's our clean brush. And what I would do after this too, you could repeat this process a couple times, but something I've really found, I'll be right back. I need to go grab this product to show folks.
I think this is actually a better method for the brush as well, because mineral are harsh on it.
And the folks at Trikel would probably sing you praises right now, because I know that's a big,
more of a do as I say, not as I do. I don't do it. I'm the worst for cleaning.
Y'all should, if you haven't already. Trikel does have some really nice products for brush conditioning and brush cleaning, but one I've used for many years is the Masters brush cleaning soap. This stuff is awesome. It's another one of those things where when I buy a big tub of it, it'll last me like 2 to 3 years, maybe longer. I think I'm going on 2 years with this tub, and I'm only halfway through it. What you can do after you've done a good thorough cleanup with the safflower oil, what you can then follow up is get some good soap and water, and really do a nice job of cleaning your brushes out after with a good brush conditioner. Either something like the Masters brush soap. You could use Trikel has a number of great brush cleaning products. Sometimes though, I use Murphy's oil soap. Murphy's oil soap is a godsend. Or if you're really on a budget, you can even get away with like a Dawn dish soap too, and really work it in. Make sure you're thoroughly rinsing your brushes out afterwards with soap and water. You don't want to have and the water aspect. Make sure you're doing a good job getting everything out of your brush so there isn't any conditioner or brush cleaner or anything later on when you go to paint. But see, look, that brush is almost clean. I feel like if I were to get a good brush soap and some water in there right now, it would be like brand new.
Yeah, I think another thing to mention, which would almost be an interim between having no solvents in your studio and going fully solvent free, I would actually say you could just get solvents and use them outside. Like if you don't want them in your studio, just clean your brushes outside, and then you're not having to worry so much about a contained space. You know, so one thing that we did when I worked with Max Ginsburg is we would always get into good studio practices at the end and clean our brushes with soap and water in a slop sink, and just make it part of the process. So, well, that was awesome, Mary. I'm sure we're going to have a ton more questions too. Let me ask one quick one before we jump into it. For those who are like, I'm on septic at my house, and I try not to put any extra oils into my septic tank. If you're going to do soap and water, you would recommend a slop sink, right?
Yeah, definitely. In that situation, if your water source doesn't hook up to a mainline sewage, that's a really good point. I'm glad you brought that up.
All right, so why don't we open it up to the Q&A. Ask your questions in the chat. We have a ton of good links in the chat. Kalina was awesome about putting that together. Kalina is going to moderate the Q&A. I've taken a lot of notes here too. I every time we chat, I think I learn even more. So type your questions if you have them in the chat. It's about 2:30. We're a little over with time, so why don't we do about a 20-minute Q&A? Kalina, is that you good with that?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
All right,
That sounds good for me too. Yep.
So I like to kind of group the questions together. So if you could type part of what your question is about, that way, then I can kind of consolidate them. And while y'all are doing that, I'll ask my question first. So Mary, is there a reason that you would use safflower oil instead of linseed oil to clean your brushes?
Oh, that's a great question, because it does bear noting how linseed oil would also work as a solvent-free brush cleaner. So would walnut oil, poppy oil. Even if you were in a pinch, a solvent-free medium, like solvent-free gel or solvent-free fluid, would work in the same way I just demonstrated with the small cup for brush cleaning. The reason why safflower oil works, it just works much more effectively in terms of quickly getting the oil out. I think it has something to do with how safflower oil is a slightly lower viscosity. It's a slightly thinner oil. It does a quicker job of cutting the paint and medium out of your bristles in a relatively effective manner. If you did have linseed oil and you didn't have safflower oil handy, it will likely work just as good, actually.
Cool, thank you.